Tensions between the United States and Iran have escalated dramatically as military strikes continue across Iranian territory while political battles unfold in Washington. The crisis deepened after the U.S. Senate rejected a resolution that would have limited the president's ability to conduct military operations against Iran without explicit approval from Congress. The vote has ignited intense debate about war powers, constitutional authority, and the potential for a prolonged conflict in the Middle East. At the same time, the bombing campaign has intensified, raising fears that the situation could spiral into a wider regional war involving multiple countries. With military operations ongoing and political divisions widening in the United States, the world is watching closely to see whether diplomacy or further escalation will define the next phase of the crisis. Escalating military strikes. The conflict between the United States and Iran entered a dangerous new phase after a series of coordinated airstrikes targeted Iranian military installations and strategic infrastructure. The attacks reportedly focused on missile bases, weapons depots, and facilities believed to be linked to Iran's nuclear and defense programs. These strikes were part of a broader effort by the United States to weaken Iran's military capabilities and deter further aggression in the region. Military officials described the operation as a necessary response to growing threats from Iran and its regional allies. In response, Iran condemned the attacks as acts of aggression and vowed retaliation. Iranian leaders warned that any continued military action would trigger further responses targeting U.S. forces and allied interests across the Middle East. As explosions rocked several areas inside Iran, fears grew that the confrontation could expand into a broader war. Political firestorm in Washington. While bombs fell overseas, a major political battle unfolded in Washington, where lawmakers debated whether Congress should limit the president's authority to wage war. The Senate considered a war powers resolution that would have required congressional authorization for continued military action against Iran. Supporters of the measure argued that the Constitution clearly gives Congress the authority to decide when the nation enters a war. However, the resolution ultimately failed in the Senate after lawmakers voted against it. The decision effectively allowed President Donald Trump to continue directing military operations against Iran without new approval from Congress. The outcome of the vote sparked fierce debate across the political spectrum. A rare bipartisan divide. Although the vote largely reflected party divisions, several senators broke ranks, highlighting the complex political dynamics surrounding the conflict. Some Republican lawmakers supported efforts to limit presidential war powers, arguing that Congress must maintain its constitutional role in decisions involving war. At the same time, a few Democrats opposed the resolution, saying that restricting the president during an active military confrontation could weaken the United States and embolden adversaries. The unusual cross-party split illustrated how national security crises often disrupt traditional political alignments. The constitutional debate over war powers. At the center of the controversy is a long-standing debate over who has the authority to initiate military conflict. Under the U.S. Constitution, Congress has the power to declare war, while the president serves as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Over the decades, however, presidents from both political parties have launched military operations without formal declarations of war. In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution of 1973 in an attempt to clarify the limits of presidential authority. The law requires the president to notify Congress when U.S. forces are introduced into hostilities and sets time limits for military engagements without congressional approval. Despite the law, tensions between Congress and the White House over war powers have persisted for decades. The current conflict with Iran has once again brought that debate to the forefront of American politics. Operation Epic Fury. Reports indicate that the ongoing strikes against Iran are part of a large-scale military campaign referred to by officials as Operation Epic Fury. The operation involves coordinated airstrikes and military actions aimed at disabling Iran's missile systems, military bases, and other strategic assets. U.S. officials argue that the mission is designed to reduce Iran's ability to threaten American forces and allies in the region. Critics, however, warn that such operations risk escalating tensions and could provoke a broader conflict involving multiple countries in the Middle East. Rising tensions across the region. The confrontation between the United States and Iran has sent shockwaves across the Middle East. Regional governments are watching the situation closely, concerned that the conflict could spill across borders and draw neighboring countries into the fighting. Iran has warned that it could target U.S. military bases and allied forces if the bombing campaign continues. Such retaliation could trigger additional strikes and further escalate the crisis. Meanwhile, military forces throughout the region have been placed on heightened alert. The possibility of proxy conflicts involving armed groups aligned with Iran has also increased concerns among analysts and diplomats. Global economic concerns. The conflict is not only a geopolitical crisis but also an economic one. Energy markets have reacted nervously to the escalating hostilities, particularly because of the strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway serves as one of the most critical oil shipping routes in the world, carrying a large percentage of global oil exports. Iranian officials have hinted that the country could disrupt shipping through the strait if the conflict intensifies. Even the threat of such action has caused concern among global markets and energy analysts. A major disruption could send oil prices soaring and create ripple effects throughout the global economy. Concerns about another long war. Many critics of the military campaign worry that the United States could become involved in another prolonged conflict in the Middle East. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan lasted for decades and cost trillions of dollars, as well as thousands of lives. Some lawmakers and analysts fear that a war with Iran could be even more complex and dangerous due to the country's size, military capabilities, and regional alliances. These concerns have fueled calls for greater congressional oversight and a clearer strategy from the administration. Supporters argue for strong action. Supporters of the military campaign argue that decisive action is necessary to confront Iranian aggression and maintain stability in the region. They say Iran's missile programs, military activities, and alliances with armed groups across the Middle East pose serious threats to U.S. allies and global security. From this perspective, the bombing campaign is intended to send a clear message that aggressive actions will not be tolerated. Advocates of the operation also argue that showing military strength can prevent larger conflicts by deterring adversaries from further escalation. Public opinion divided. The American public appears deeply divided over the conflict. Some citizens support the strikes and believe the United States must confront Iran to protect its interests and allies. Others fear that the country is once again entering a costly and dangerous war with no clear end. Public opinion polls suggest that Americans are wary of new military interventions after decades of conflict in the Middle East. This divide reflects broader political and cultural debates about America's role in global security. The next political battle. Although the Senate rejected the War Powers Resolution, the debate over the conflict is far from finished. Lawmakers in the House of Representatives are expected to consider similar legislation aimed at limiting the president's authority to continue the military campaign. However, passing such a measure would face significant obstacles. Even if both chambers of Congress approve the legislation, the president could veto it. Overriding a presidential veto would require a two-thirds majority in both the House and the Senate, a difficult threshold to reach. As a result, the political struggle over war powers is likely to continue. The risk of regional war. One of the most alarming aspects of the conflict is the possibility that it could spread beyond the United States and Iran. Several Middle Eastern countries host U.S. military bases, making them potential targets if Iran decides to retaliate against American forces. In addition, Iran maintains relationships with various armed groups throughout the region. These groups could become involved in the conflict, potentially expanding the fighting across multiple countries. Such a scenario would dramatically increase the scale and complexity of the war. The diplomatic path forward. Despite the escalating violence, some international leaders are urging diplomacy. Several governments and international organizations have called for immediate negotiations to prevent further escalation. Diplomats argue that dialogue remains the best way to resolve tensions and avoid a devastating regional conflict. However, achieving meaningful negotiations will likely be difficult given the current level of hostility and mistrust between the United States and Iran. A defining moment for U.S. foreign policy. The Senate's decision not to limit presidential war powers marks a significant moment in American politics. It highlights the ongoing struggle between Congress and the White House over who should control decisions about war. Supporters of the administration view the vote as a necessary step to maintain strong leadership during a time of crisis. Critics, on the other hand, worry that Congress may be surrendering its constitutional responsibility to oversee military action. The outcome of this debate could shape U.S. foreign policy for years to come. Conclusion. As airstrikes continue and political tensions rise, the confrontation between the United States and Iran has become one of the most serious global crises in recent years. The Senate's failure to curb the president's war powers means that military operations are likely to continue, at least for now. Whether the conflict escalates further or eventually gives way to diplomacy remains uncertain. What is clear is that the decisions made in Washington and Tehran in the coming weeks could have far-reaching consequences for regional stability, global markets, and international security. The world now watches anxiously as two powerful nations stand on the brink of a conflict that could reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East.